Welcome to a special bonus episode of Mind of State. I'm Betty Tang.
And I'm Michael Epstein, and together we are your hosts. Here at Mind of State, we don't so much discuss the news as psychoanalyze it by talking to some of the smartest, most interesting minds in the mental health and social sciences. Hi, Betty.
Hey, Michael.
How are you?
I'm good.
Well, today, actually, we're going to really live by that moniker of not so much discussing the news as psychoanalyzing it. We are bringing back with us today. Peter, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
All right.
Welcome back.
So Peter
Thank
Glick,
you.
Welcome back, Peter. So Peter Glick joined us with his colleague Susan Fisk earlier this week to talk about the psychology of prejudice and in particular anti-Semitism. And we recorded that episode before all of the controversy on Twitter with Representative Ilhan Omar and her tweet about Israel. And as soon as it happened and everything, I went back to the podcast, Peter, and listened to it again, and it was so helpful for me to understand it. I felt the need to bring you back, as did Betty.
Yeah, it was very grounding. So we wanted to ground more.
To, walk onto the hot lava of Israeli-Palestinian conflict and anti-Semitism, which you're very brave to do. So welcome back to Mind of State.
Thanks for making me a special bonus.
You are a special bonus. Every day.
Exactly. So listen, for those who don't know, I can't imagine at this point if you're a listener to this podcast, but, earlier this week, I think over the weekend, there were a series of tweets from Representative Omar, who represents Minnesota in the U.S. Congress, in the House of Representatives. She was initially responding to a tweet from Glenn Greenwald, who is a reporter, used to write for The Guardian, now is with The Intercept, I think. And his tweet was fairly innocuous, but I'll read it out loud to give everybody some grounding. GOP leader Kevin McCarthy threatens punishment for Representative Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who are both, by the way, two the first, I believe, Muslim women.
Muslim congresswomen.
Right. Over criticisms of Israel. It is stunning how much time U.S. political leaders spend defending a foreign nation, even if it means attacking free speech rights of Americans. And then there was a link to Haaretz. So basically, Glenn Greenwald was criticizing Kevin McCarthy, who's the Republican leader in the House, for attacking Representative Omar and Representative Tlaib. Representative Omar then retweeted it with a comment, and that comment was, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." And then somebody from the Jewish Daily Forward asked her on Twitter what she meant by that, and she responded, AIPAC. With, I think, an exclamation point. So, Peter, I guess the first thing is just emotionally, if you can, how you took it, how you felt when you saw it. What was your response before anything else?
Yeah, I guess maybe my first response is, here we go again, right? So, I think the tweet that Representative Omar's tweet was bad, but I don't want to pile on to her at this point. I think that, she's made an apology, and I think, and we should talk about this whole sort of cycle of tweets and apologies and all of that. As some commentators have pointed out, it's very rich that McCarthy was calling for this punishment when he is subscribed to.
Oh, he's trafficked in the same thing.
Right. So,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, I'm shocked to find that anti-Semitism is going on around here kind of rhetoric. And, it's become really a political football. And I know what you two and I want to do is to kind of pull back and think about, how do we pick apart where we might draw some lines, and where is legitimate criticism of Israel, of lobbyists for Israel, of policy toward Palestinians. I mean, all of that is, really legitimate stuff to criticize. And I think
the reason we brought you back, Peter, was because I think there's a fair amount of confusion, and nobody really feels at this point there's no value in name calling. And, like you, we want to really dive in. And I think that there were two things for me, because I had a lot of conversations this week with friends and family. And, the first thing is why were people offended? Why? Because a lot of people don't think that she was trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes. So where is the argument to start with for people who were upset or offended?
Right. So, we've talked about this on the earlier podcast, the stereotype of Jews as this kind of cabal with greater influence in the world, using money to corrupt and to buy influence. And so, it really feeds in. It's if you understand the context and the history, then her tweet that it was all about the money, really feeds into that conspiracy theory kind of view, and then piling it all onto AIPAC as Jewish lobbyists control American policy, and the same thing with Greenwald saying that, and I'm kind of assuming he's Jewish actually, or at least by birth. Piling on, in that way, that also raises those specters. Now, I think, it's something to be sensitive to, but it shouldn't be quashing criticism of Israel. It shouldn't be quashing criticism of lobbyists or any of that sort of thing. But it's generalizing it in a way. And of course, Twitter is not really conducive to, a really nuanced kind of discussion.
Really, I find Twitter very subtle and,
I mean, this
right.
This goes to your. I believe we talked about this in the podcast about how social media spins us, and part of our goal here is to stop the spin and to analyze rather than react. And so, what you're saying, Peter, is that the cabal, or the conspiracy, is that Jews are this competent minority, and therefore, as competent, as we said in the podcast, threatening, and they have this money, and they drive. There's this grand sort of power that they possess with banking and money under their control.
Right. I think that's the question, right? Can you put the all about the Benjamins in the context of how you look at in your stereotype content, and the
right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's very similar to the kind of conspiracy theories that McCarthy also, has been endorsing, that there are these Jewish bankers, Jewish financiers, that they control all this money, and they therefore have outsized influence. When we also have people who are not Jewish who have a lot of money, who have this kind of influence. But it's the question is there kind of a moral double standard that's subtly baked into the comments? Is it kind of drawing out a wider stereotype and this implication that Jews are out there as this particularly powerful minority group that is involved in these secretive conspiracies by which they wield outsized influence over everything? And of course, it's hard to know sometimes where to draw these lines. So there is, a lobby for Israel that might be more powerful than a lot of other lobbies. There's also the NRA, which is an extremely powerful lobby, but it's not associated with a particular ethnic or religious group. So,
and it's not having conspiracy theories drawn about the NRA. Well, there are some narratives about the NRA.
I think that's interesting you bring that up, because a lot of people say, well, all she's doing is criticizing lobbyists. So how is it okay to criticize the NRA? How is it okay to criticize, say, big oil, if you're an environmentalist, and not okay to criticize AIPAC? She's just calling out lobbyists for what they do. How is that anti-Semitic?
And I don't think if it's just calling out lobbyists for what they do, I don't think it is anti-Semitic, and I don't think that you can, shield yourself from any criticism by, just claiming that any criticism of your group or of your nation's policies is reflecting is racist, anti-Semitic, whatever. So I think that we have to draw those lines, and where those lines exactly occur, that can be subtle and difficult, and we could legitimately disagree on how bad the comment is. So the question, and again, Twitter. I mean, I feel in some ways, I think politicians are under a lot of pressure to use Twitter. It got Trump elected, arguably, and AOC, right? She's become very adept. She's very adept at social media, and she's gotten tons of attention. And so, really, using social media and sites like Twitter is something that has become really incentivized for politicians, and it demands this kind of fast reaction, which gets people in trouble. So,
it also precludes thinking, because it's just all reaction, action, tweet, comment, and repartee. That's dangerous. It seems like in this context, in this situation,
and certainly, she's she's apologized previously. And I don't mean to pile on here, but there's the context for her prior tweet from several years earlier that Jews had hypnotized people to support Israel, or at least that was the sort of implication. I think she used the word hypnotize.
Well,
and that seems to resonate with this kind of secret cabal sort of thing. I mean, it's hard because I think we're taking very short comments, and we're also reading something into them. But when that's there in the background as kind of cultural stereotypes with a very bad history, you can see why Jews would be very sensitized to them. If she'd written an extensive criticism of AIPAC and stuck to the facts, I think she could have a very powerful argument about the influence of this particular lobby group. I don't think she should be precluded or censored in any way from making a specific criticism of a specific lobby. Not just having to talk about lobbyists in general. I have no problem with her, criticizing AIPAC and talking about it in a kind of factual way that really makes the case. The problem is when you make these overarching kinds of comments that
it's the language you use,
these stereotypes,
and the manner in which she used it. It was like the language, whatever the content of it was quick and flip and resident of
something that is pernicious and ugly. I mean, I think it's interesting if we can flip the conversation for a sec, because I think that the Jewish community, of which I am a member, I would have defended her criticizing AIPAC, and I would have defended her criticisms of Israel and the Netanyahu government. I mean, it's very hard to believe in a social contract and inalienable rights and to not look at the plight of the Palestinians in the occupied territories and not think that at the very minimum the status quo must change. But criticisms of Israel, criticisms of AIPAC, on the other side, are too often conflated with anti-Semitism. And I wonder if you could speak to that, because in some ways I think that's just as much a part of this dynamic. And I think it's part of why we can't talk about this now and why people couldn't see why this language was so dangerous, because they also look at it and say, oh, so now, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, so I can't say anything? Is that what you're telling me?
Right, and I think you're absolutely right that that's a very dangerous road to go down, is to say that, we can't have any kind of criticism. I think, again, it's sort of criticism that sticks to the facts, that builds a case without implying motives on the part of a broad group of people. And that, it's like dog whistles in politics. We talk about racist dog whistles. They can be subtle or more overt, and the more subtle ones, you have to see that connection in historical context, and you have to be aware of that. And that's, to Representative Omar's credit, she, that's what she said in her apology, is like thinking about the context of these stereotypes in this history, that's why she apologized. So I think that's really good, and I don't think she should be ostracized any further.
For sure not.
I think it's this should be a kind of a moment where we reflect on this and how do we want to frame these debates so that we can have legitimate discussion and criticism of, for instance, lobbyists and the
Israel.
state of Israel and all of that.
As I said to somebody, if she came out in support of BDS, the movement to
support the Palestinian effort
through a boycott, I would have defended that right. I may have even, you know what I mean? There's too many of these hot button toxic things where all of a sudden I think people are quick to charge anti-Semitism so that when it shows up, it's like the boy who cries wolf. When it comes up, you don't have the language anymore to discuss it.
Well, and we go back to Greenwald's comment in McCarthy's criticism of Omar and Representative Tlaib. These are two freshman women, congresswomen, who are the first Muslims to sit on in the House, and the significance of their identity can't be obscured here. That McCarthy was calling them out for criticism of Israel, and I think that the situation was sitting on a tinderbox from the beginning.
Exactly.
And
he's trafficking in terrible stereotypes too.
Absolutely. And that he's stoking something. And as you put it, Peter, there was a political football that's getting tossed back and forth, or I think it's a flaming baton. And who's going to get burned? And underneath it is what we're missing, which is the meaning of all of this. And it's the drama is distracting all of us of all this finger pointing and this incendiary language and implications. All being looked at between the lines, and David Duke enters into the fray, and that's another Molotov cocktail into it with his calling the Jews guerrillas, Zionist guerrillas, which is abhorrent and
a mixed metaphor, man.
Get
your racism straight. Get your racism straight,
I didn't even
dude.
get that. That sort of stopped me when I saw that.
Actually, yeah, Peter, can you do us a favor?
Is it an elephant in the room? What are we talking about here?
Can you go back and help us understand, at least as you and Susan and others like Amy Cuddy, look at something like anti-Semitism and why it is so
hot button.
Well, and also why it just sort of holds no political party. Everybody can pick that baton up, as you put it, and be anti-Semitic. The left, the right, doesn't really, have any domain. What is the dynamic as you see it of anti-Semitism? Again, I know we did it on Tuesday.
Right.
And could you put it then in the context of it's all about the Benjamins?
Right. So, we can go into the deeper dive, which would be really the historical circumstances that have always seemed to conspire to put the Jews in what we call the envious prejudice category, that is of a perceived competent, in fact, maybe even hyper-competent and powerful group that is seen, though, also as having ill intent toward the rest of society. And that really traces back through 2,000 years of history. As we all know, Jesus was a Jew. Christianity came out of Judaism. Judaism was the parent religion. And one of the big tasks of early Christianity was to, it was improbable that it survived and spread as it did historically. One of the big tasks was to explain how Jesus was the Messiah, when most Jews at the time rejected his messiahhood. And that really, the answer to that was, well, you're denying the Son of God, you must be evil. You must be, sons of the devil, right? And we get into early Christian writings, including to the New Testament, some anti-Semitic statements because of this close relationship. And Judaism, if we think back then, now Christianity is the powerful religion. Back then, Judaism was the parent religion, and Christianity was this small breakaway sect that had to establish itself and give itself credibility. So, right from the start, we have that, and that led to, Jews as this having this evil intent. I mean, and literally being allied with the devil through most of history from the founding of Christianity, and that's kind of the beginning of it. And then this got changed. Also, it's kind of like this historical circumstances changed in ways that still conspire to put Jews into the same categories. If you're allied with the devil, you must be powerful, right? And, plague was blamed on witches. It was also blamed on the Jews. As allies of the devil, you could potentially somehow mysteriously have these occult powers to cause the plague. And then, of course, Jews also became money lenders because there was a Christian prohibition against doing that, and it became a space that Jews were allowed to occupy. Well, that's not a great space to be in. Nobody likes the person who lends them money and charges them interest. And so, there too, and of course, then you get some prominent Jews in banking, and that's again that middleman minority, that envious prejudice category, and then we go through more recently with the establishment of the state of Israel, and it's a powerful little country. So there too it now becomes potentially seen as the oppressor, and this minority that has, or this small country that has more power than other countries its size, influence in the United States. And so all of these really keep Jews in that same category, and it becomes all, again, I think the key thing is this perception of ill intent. And if you generalize that intention, that's very different than saying, okay, here's some policies that really are wrong, immoral. I don't have any problems with saying, some of the current Israeli policies toward Palestinians are immoral, and you make the case and you build it on the facts. But when you start to imply that Jews have evil intent, right, that's where you're starting to cross that line. Where exactly does that happen? I think we could debate that in any specific instance. Some will be more obvious than others, but that's where I think it goes over the line and feeds into all this whole historical context that, generated the Holocaust, for example. I mean, the Nazis, if you ever, I do a course on the Holocaust, and one of the things I show is the film The Eternal Jew, which is banned in Germany, but you can find a copy of this film. And, one of the things that the Nazis complained about the Jews was, for instance, too much Jewish doctors, right? Too many Jewish doctors. Well, that seems like a weird complaint. There's all these Jewish doctors, right? But, you can see how that fits into this high status minority kind of conception, right? The competence becomes a negative trait because it's presumed to be combined with evil intentions.
And from what you're saying across history, what strikes me is that there's a symbolism that gets attached to being Jewish, and that instead of policies, as you mentioned about Palestinians needing more rights in Israel, it becomes emotional. That there is this emotional attachment to what a Jew is, which has developed across history as being the killer of Christ. But that had emerged as a competition between Christianity and Judaism being the parent religion, as you mentioned. So there's an edible conflict in our language of psychoanalysis, this competition between a presiding stable religion and a new religion that needed to supersede its parent. And then now the Jews have become symbolized as these figures of usurious middlemen, and so it's an emotional. Greed. It's emotional, and so we can't talk and think about policy when you're dealing with this emotional symbol.
Well, and on the other side, I will say, Betty, I find it disgusting that the Senate is taking up a bill to effectively make free speech illegal as it comes to the BDS movement.
Yeah,
it's so profoundly
absurd
and deeply un-American, and that they're using it, and that they're using it. People like Marco Rubio and others are using it as a way to charge, people like Taib and Omar with anti-Semitism for just criticizing. I mean, what? It seems like everybody's lost their mind.
Well,
Peter.
it's like Mitch McConnell saying on the Senate floor, the expansion of voting is a power grab by the immigrants to.
It's a different podcast.
It's a different subject, but
right. And look, Donald Trump comes into the middle of all of this and says that Omar should resign. It's the whole thing is just depressing because we don't know how to talk about it, and I think you're right. I mean, look, I think what struck me personally. When I read the tweet as so problematic is that it implied that congressmen, women, the people would not support Israel were it not for the money, right? It's all about the Benjamins. If it wasn't for the Jewish money, these people would hold different opinions. And that was, for me, the third rail. That I had an emotional response, I'll be honest. Right, and I'm very critical of Israel, but that just hit me like at a deep emotional level because the implication is they wouldn't believe this or act this way were it not for a minority having outsized influence because of their money.
Yeah, and I want to go back to a couple, to play to Betty's psychoanalytic themes. A couple of themes that really come out of these stereotypes of Jews. There's two things. One is this kind of almost mythic power that Jews, have this almost that hypnotizing comment, right, is an example of that there's something almost this uncanny kind of mythic, strange, almost occult power that the Jews have, these chosen people of the Bible, right? That's not a good way to label yourself as the chosen people of God, right? It's bound to create some resentment from others. But that's another aspect of this general attitude toward the Jews. And then the other theme that you mentioned, Betty, which is betrayal, right? That the Jews are ready to betray us. And that's, the Nazis stab in the back theory. We accepted them into our country, pre-Nazi Germany was actually a pretty good place to be a Jew in Europe. And yet that was used against Jews because we accepted you, was the Nazis' line. We were nice to you and you stabbed us in the back. And of course, we see that also in the theme of the Judas kiss, right? Jews as the betrayer. And this plays right through to the idea that Jews are more, American Jews might be more loyal to Israel than they are to the U.S.
And David Duke,
they're suspect.
David Duke spoke to this in his meme, saying that the gorilla in the room that nobody dared to challenge until now, it is time to end the Zionist takeover of America. And he's expressing exactly what you have just described, and paradoxically supported and was disappointed when Omar apologized. And I think the symbolism has to be taken to the fact that here is a freshman young congresswoman who is one of the first Muslims to hold a seat in the House of Representatives, and that she represents something by her identities. And
she's a threat.
She's a threat, exactly. And she's easily taken down because if she's in the position of Nancy Pelosi, I think we would be having a very different conversation. It would be more complex, but she doesn't have the power that some of these men who've been attacking her do. And
they're threatened by her presence. They just simply are. And they're trying to silence her. And that's, I think, the shame of all of this. Is that I think she has important things to say and to contribute that need to be contributed, that should be in a free and democratic society, and that they're using this as a way of silencing her. And
she herself is a historic figure, right.
But on the other side of it, you have people who I've been talking to all week saying she didn't do anything wrong. And what also, Peter, and then we should probably wrap up, but what depressed me and what prompted me to reach out to you was the seeming like lack of interest that so many quote unquote progressives had in trying to empathize or at least stop and say, well, why is everybody so upset? Like there was no moment, we were so entrenched, well, lobbyists are awful, money is awful, Israel's awful, so it's not anti-Semitic. And I remember saying to somebody like, wait, don't you care that people are hurt? Like where is the...
Right. I mean, I think something that Peter, that you pointed to is the issue of time. You know, we're not thinking about history, and we're not thinking about the time that is these tweets are coming fast and furious. And, you know, before anybody can think about what happened, somebody's tweeting something else. And before we know it, David Duke is weighing in. And that's like a big Molotov cocktail in the middle of all of this. This white supremacist has now sort of thrown his hat into the ring. And how... One of the things before we go, Peter, how do we get beyond this? How do we engender a place where we can think rather than create these crises, these Twitter crises?
I think it's really hard because the pressures are out there on politicians because social media gets you attention. And of course, that's the oxygen of politics. So, you know, I think it's you know, and more nuanced discussion often doesn't really sell as well as dog whistles and
conflict,
you know, and quick reactions and playing to your base. And I think the point about progressives, I mean, the anti-Semitism of the left, I think, happens when the Jews are just placed firmly into this oppressor category, and therefore it's okay to say anything bad about the oppressor because, like white men, they're basically bad, you know, responsible for all that is bad, and then being oppressed becomes kind of a shield, right? If my group is oppressed, then we can't be criticized, but we can criticize you. So, you know, Jews occupy this really weird position. It's like, hey, wait, we have been oppressed. Hello, you know, the Holocaust, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. But now with, you know, on the left, it's going to be all about Israel as the oppressor. And again, just sort of generalizing this when this kind of just becomes this, you know, polarized, overarching, you know, not a discussion, not about the facts so much as this overall emotion, like you said, Michael, then I think that's where it gets really problematic.
Well, listen, thank you. As Betty, as you were talking about David Duke, I was thinking what Peter had said to us earlier in the last episode. You know, these tweets were the most bizarre things. You had David Duke, you had all these progressive left-wing people. Chris Hayes saying, you know, and it was like, what a weird mix of people, all basically defending this tweet. I mean, you had a grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan for vastly different reasons that, granted, I'm not suggesting for the same reason, as, you know, some of the most progressive people that I follow defending the tweet. And I was thinking, like, back to your comment, Peter, it's like, who thinks the Jews are clever, right? Jews and anti-Semites.
Hey, well, at least the Jews can unite, you know, the left, the extreme left with the extreme right. And right,
it's a kumbaya moment.
Muslim extremists with Christian extremists, you know, I mean, who can bring them all together? Only the Jews.
There you go. Well, listen, thank you guys. Peter, thank you very much for coming back on such short notice and dipping your toe into this troubled water.
Thanks for helping us try to make sense of this.
I want to be a co-host now. So
that's right. You're all close. You're closer than the other guest.
Come move to New York.
I should at least get a T-shirt or something.
Oh,
absolutely.
Oh, we have to get those going.
Yeah.
Definitely, right. Definitely. Well, listen, thanks a lot, Peter. You have reached the end of this special episode, and as my rabbi likes to say to me, take your problems home with you. Mind Estate is a production of Mind Estate Media, LLC, and Hanger Studios, NYC. Our Crackerjack producer is Caroline Quash. Our engineer today is Jack Dixon. Mind Estate's original music is composed by Joel Goodman, courtesy of Uber Music. I'm Michael Epstein.
And I'm Betty Tang. You can connect with us on Twitter at Mind of State Pod, on our Facebook page, and at our website, mindofstate.com. You can also subscribe to our show at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.